Recording is made in February of 1996. My father, John J. O'Neill, was born February 18th in 1878 in County Clare, in the district of Labushiba, in the town of Kilkerran in Ireland. His mother's maiden name was Ellen Birmingham. The father's name was Thomas. He died in Ireland. The family were very poor farmers. His sister was Mary, and she was born in 1876 and was the eldest. She came to this country approximately 1894 and worked for the Larkin family, who owned the Larkin store. However, she worked for the Larkins as a housemaid on the west side of Buffalo, near the Peace Bridge at the family residence. A few years later, John, my father, Nell, Tom, and their mother, Grandma Ellen, came to this country, and that was approximately in 1903. The boat took 24 days to cross the Atlantic, and it was not a pleasant experience. It cost $29 each, and they landed in New York and were processed through Ellis Island. In those days, you needed a sponsor, and it appears that Mary, their daughter, was their sponsor. The story goes that Grandma Ellen was always dressed in black, she always smoked a corn cob, and she invented most of the four-letter words. When my father came to Buffalo with his mother and his brother Tom and sister Nell, my father went to work on June 23, 1905, for the New York Central Railroad. He retired April 30th, 1948, after 42 years and 10 months. His position was called a car inspector. His sister Mary married Tom Cullinan, who was a city fireman in approximately 1895. And they had 5 boys and 2 girls. All have passed away. They lived for a while at 430 Shumway Street, and later they moved to Leroy, a street near Main Street. His sister Nell married Thomas Hanley, and they had 2 children, Thomas and Ellen. Thomas, the husband, died early on, and then Nell married Hank O'Neill. They had no children. They lived a long time on Mackinac Street in the First Ward. Ellen died early, and Tom married Alice Shine, and they had 3 boys and 2 girls. The girls live to this day next door to where my sister lived, Sister Grace on Mumford Street. Tom married Mary Sullivan, and they first lived on 7th Avenue, then on Ladner Street. Later they bought a double house on Columbus, and they had 3 children, John, Winnie, and Maureen. Tom's first job was taking cash or tickets for the trolley lines. Later, he too went to work for the New York Central. Tom was born in 1887 and died in 1948 in the hospital of serious stomach problems. Mary, his wife, maiden name was Sullivan, and she was born in 1891 and died April 6, 1963. Aunt Mary had a sister named Winnie who worked for years for the telephone company, and also she had a brother, Jim Sullivan, who later moved to California with his wife, Laura. Tom O'Neill and Mary had 3 children. John, who married Florence Vieira, and he worked for the Buffalo Streets Department, and they had 2 girls, Carol and Peggy. Winnie, who married Wally Schwartz, had 4 sons, and Maureen, who married Hank Lose, and she died in 1984. At one time, he ran a store on Seneca Street. He sold tires, bikes, toys, and accessories. He later ran a Gulf gas station next door to the Larkin building. Before his death, he owned Goodrich's Tavern at Point Breeze on the Lake Erie at Evans, and that restaurant was destroyed in a fire. They had 3 children, Joe, Eileen, and John. Joey married Sharon Walters. Eileen married a boy by the name of Ross, and John married Trish Higgins. And they live on East and West Road and have 2 children. They are Maureen and Johnny. After Hank Lose died, Maureen married Elmer Abrams. Sharon and Joe had 2 sons, Joey and Jim. Shortly after coming to Buffalo, my father married Anna Chambers, and they lived upstairs over the Gavins. Anna Chambers' sister was Lizzie Gavin. Their house was on South Park near Elk Street. My father and Anna had 4 children, and they were Mabel, born in 1909, Tom in 1910, Elizabeth in 1912, and Eleanor, born in 1915. John's wife died very young and very quick of pneumonia. The story goes she caught cold hanging up clothes in the backyard. Of course, in those days, miracle drugs like penicillin were not invented yet. After her death, my father moved his 4 children to 36 Minton Street off of Smith Street. My father had to hire a full-time babysitter for the children. For whatever reason, his choice was a full-blooded Indian woman who was extremely mean to the 4 kids. Every chance they got, they would run back to their Aunt Lizzie Gavin for protection. It was on Minton Street my father met Margaret McKendry, and they were married and bought a house at 17 Clio in South Buffalo. My father and my mother had 3 new children, Mary, born in 1918, Grace in 1919, and myself, born in 1923. All 3 of us were born at Our Lady of Victory Hospital. We were attended by Dr. Brown, of course, Our Lady of Victory in Lackawanna. Elizabeth died very early of what they call black diphtheria. After contacting this dreaded disease, she died in a matter of 3 days. The disease closed off the windpipe. In the early days, the Board of Health was notified of any communicable disease. The house was quarantined, placed off limits to everybody. A sign was mailed to the front of the house notifying everybody of this fact. A visiting nurse would tend to Elizabeth in the morning, then seal up the bedroom door with wax so she would know if anyone broke the seal. The story goes our father would break open the seal to tend his little girl, then reseal the door with wax so the nurse wouldn't get wise. For years, my father's nickname was Hero, and maybe that was the reason. The 3 older children, Mabel, Tom, and Eleanor, were very fond of their new mother and grew more fond over the years, and we all stood up for each other. I don't know how we all slept, and maybe in 1 or 2 bedroom, it had a 3-bedroom house, but we only had 1 bathroom. Our mother was born in Avon, New York in 1878. Her mother's name was Mary Wall, and she was born in 1856 and died in 1935. My mother's father's name was John McKendry, and he was born in 1856, but died early in 1911. The Walls were a prominent family and well-to-do. Grandma McKendry brought up her children, 3 boys and 4 girls, as a very close-knit family. After moving off Minton Street, without my mother, who of course had married my father, they moved to 15 West Oakwood Place off of Main Street. Only my Uncle John and our mother ever got married. Grandma McKendry did not appreciate my father marrying her oldest daughter, and the story goes my father never went into 15 West Oakwood. The oldest son was Jim, who was a controller for the Peace Bridge. John, who owned Peerless Mill Supply. Morris, who owned the funeral home. Sade was a secretary for the Abstract Title and Mortgage Company. Nell was a very good secretary who loved Florida and made many trips back and forth. And the last 2, youngest, were Mary and Grace, who worked as salesperson at the Larkin Company. Our father became a citizen of the U.S. at age 39. His papers say this happened on February 5th, 1919. The papers described him as 5 foot 6.5 inches tall, gray eyes, brown hair, and carried a weight of 174 pounds. I also remember my father had big, wide fists. He and his brother Tom were 2 tough dudes. Mabel was the first to bring around a non-Catholic boyfriend. His name was Norm Denny. We thought my father would cause a stink, but instead he took to Norm right away. Norm never had a bad word for anyone. I remember he loved to whistle. Before their marriage, Norm played the saxophone in a German band. At that time, he lived in Northampton with his parents. Mabel and Norm were married by a judge. Mabel called Aunt Lizzie the day of the marriage to tell her that she had gotten married. Aunt Lizzie called Father Deasy at St. Thomas Aquinas and insisted he bless their marriage that day before she went to bed with Norm. He did the blessing, and everything turned out okay. They lived on Dash, later at 21 or 23 Innes Road in West Seneca, and they lived in Ridgewood Village, and finally on Goodrich in Lackawanna. They had 2 children, Barbara, born in 1934, married to Don Flowers, and Norm, Jr., born 1938, married to Carol Opinski. Mabel came down with tuberculosis. Her doctor put her out to Perrysburg to get what they called the natural cure. It was a sad part of their lives that lasted 22 months, from 1942 to 1944. Barbara stayed with Downer and Tom Shanewitter, and Norm Jr. stayed with the Denneys on Northampton while Mabel was away. The natural treatment did not fully work, and her doctor heard and recommended a new surgical procedure. I believe the hospital that did the procedure was Meyer Memorial, or sometimes called the City Hospital. The surgery was a success, and the family was reunited. After Norm worked at Curtis Wright during the wartime, he worked for Clarence Sloan, who owned an automobile garage on Abbott Road. Norm was one heck of a good mechanic. Later, he got a job with the Bethlehem Steel Plant, and unfortunately, he died, just dropped over while he was punching in at the time clock. That was at age 58. Mabel passed away in 1965, and she was 56. Her wake was at Reagan Funeral Home at the corner of Salem and Abbott Road. Brother Tom was born in 1910. He loved to golf. His first job was as a golf caddy. He went to St. Bonaventure's, and during one of the summer recesses, he went to work on the Central Railroad for the summer. There, an accident, he lost a finger. When things were bad work-wise, he took a job on the railroad gang repairing and resurfacing streets. I can still remember Tom taking off his overalls, and they stood up by themselves because they were loaded with tar. This work program was called the WPA, which was part of President Roosevelt's idea to get the country moving, get the young people jobs, and to beat the Depression. Another program he started was called the CCC for young men. They went away building bridges, clearing land, building roads, sort of like an Army and a Boy Scout camp together. Tom became interested in the Young Men's Democratic League. He also sold telephones door to door. Many times he was Salesman of the Month. Later he became a congressman secretary, working in Pi Schwartz's office here in Buffalo. Schwartz died, and Tom took a job with the Internal Revenue. Shortly thereafter, Tom and Helen were married. Tom Sr. was 31, and Helen Boss O'Neill was 29. When Tom Jr. was born, he was sick as an infant, and the doctor recommended they get a transfer to warmer climate. They spent time in Asheville, Carolina, and Florida. When young Tommy was pronounced cured, they moved back to Buffalo, still with the IRS. At various times, they lived in the Parkside Project, 55 Mumford Street, Meriden Street, McKinley Parkway near Clio. Then they bought a house on Eaglewood near Abbott Road. They sold it and moved into the Marine Drive apartments. Tom retired from the IRS as senior tax lien officer and senior deputy collector with his own office and secretary. He died September 20th, 1984, of cancer of the lung. His mass was at St. Joe's Cathedral. The burial was at Holy Cross. And Helen died September 30th, 1981. And she died at Millard Fillmore Hospital of various causes. She had converted to Catholicism. And Helen died, when Helen died, she was waked, just like Tom, at Reddington Funeral Home. Burial was at Holy Cross in the coronation section. Tom and Helen had 3 children. Tom graduated from Timon and Canisius. Kathy graduated from Geneseo, and Jack graduated from Timon and Canisius. Tommy was very successful as president of Somerset Exploration Corporation. He has 2 daughters, Barbara and Laura. Kathy married John Joe Fitzpatrick. John Joe sold automotive parts, and later he bought and ran a very successful auto parts store on Main Street near Transit. Joe and Kathy have 2 boys, Joe and Josh, and 2 girls, Erin and Maggie. Tommy and Helen's youngest son was Jack O'Neill. He too worked one time at the IRS. He married Margaret McCourt. They have 2 boys, Sean and Patrick, and 1 girl, Jenny. As memory serves me, he retired from the IRS and opened several successful businesses. One is called Equity Search, and as I understand it, this business is franchised in 17 different cities. Eleanor and Tom Schoenwetter were married August 30th, 1941, and they lived on Dash Street. Before they were married, Tom took tickets for the Canadiana boat, which went to Crystal Beach. He met Eleanor through Hank Close. It was love at first sight. Later, they bought a home on Sheffield, and Tom worked at AMF and FM Burt Box Factory. He also worked part-time at Buffalo Raceway. They had 2 girls, Susan and Mary Ann, and 2 sons, Thomas and Michael. Susan was the firstborn. Eleanor's doctor was Hugh McGee, who had his office on McKinley Parkway. For whatever reason, the doctor either felt bad for Eleanor and Tom, or maybe completely missed it, but other people began to notice Susan was not progressing as an infant. At age 6 months, it was discovered she had Down syndrome. Eleanor passed away in Our Lady of Victory Hospital, May 17, 1984, and Edward, nicknamed Tom, died March 16, 1991, in the Lutheran nursing home. They had their masses at Holy Family and were waked at Nightingale's. Interment was in Holy Cross Cemetery. Susan lived a few more years, and she was in the Nazareth nursing home at the time of her death. She too was waked from Nightingale's. Tommy married Kathy. After he graduated from Canisius, he went to work for the IRS. His career took him to Syracuse, and they now live in Rochester. And they have 2 boys and 2 girls. The girls were Tammy and Sarah, and the boys were Brendan and Jason. Kathy's mother worked for years at Sattler's in their office, first at 998 Broadway, then at 75 Rosalia Street. Kathy's father's name was Casey. The mother's name was Estelle. Next came Mary Ann, and she married Billy Geary. His parents lived on Abbott Road, corner of Rutland. Bill and Mary Ann lived on Dover Street in West Seneca when they were first married, and later bought a big home on the old Lakeshore Road near the 18-Mile Creek Bridge. They had 2 children, Tricia and Nathan. Tricia graduated from St. Bonaventures and now is an on-air radio personality as a disc jockey. Nathan is still in school. Michael Schoenwetter moved to Boston, Mass. And worked there as a counselor. He was probably the first nephew to leave home and strike out on his own. He married a Sherry, and later on they moved to Buffalo and lived up in the University District off Main Street. And they had 1 son by the name of David. Mary and John Berner were married in 1939 and first rented a flat on Trowbridge off of South Park Avenue. They bought a starter home on Marilla Street near South Park Avenue. Then they bought an income home on Garvey Street. Next, they bought a real nice home on Sander Drive in Lackawanna. Their last move was to Mill Road off of Reserve Road in West Seneca. John made a career as the banana man at the A&P Tea Company. They had 4 children. The firstborn was Jack, who graduated from Bryan Stratton. Most of his working life was as a food salesman, both as an employee and owner. He married Ellen, whose maiden name was McCann, and they had 3 daughters, Kathy, Peggy, and Jennifer. Maureen married Paul Alico, who was with the Buffalo Fire Department, mostly as a lieutenant. Paul is a great artist, painter. He does ducks and birds and wildlife. Maureen worked mostly as a waitress in some of Western New York's finest restaurants. And they own a beautiful home in Boston, New York, and a lovely condo in Florida. Paul is now retired, and they spend a lot of time down south. Mary Lou attended the University of Buffalo, and after a few trips to Florida, she decided to move there and enjoy the sun 12 months a year. She lives in the Fort Lauderdale area. Never married. Johnny and Mary get to stay with her when they go to Florida. Their oldest daughter was Peggy, and she married George Kelly. Peggy was mostly a housewife, although I do remember she taught dancing at Arthur Murray's studio. George worked as a pipe coverer, and he worked in asbestos quite a bit. They have 2 girls and 2 boys. At one point, George converted to Catholicism, and they own a lovely home in Orchard Park. Bill and Grace Greeley were married in the early 40s. Grace worked downtown for the W.T. Grant Company, selling in the dress department. Bill worked for Charlie M. as a bookmaker out of his father's house on Ryan Street. Soon thereafter, Bill was appointed as a mail carrier. He loved that job and stayed until he retired. For years, he was active in the Ticket Takers and Ushers Union. He worked nights at Hamburg Raceway and Sabres hockey and Bison baseball games. Grace and Bill had Patsy, Billy, and Jean. The 2 girls studied nursing and graduated from Trocare. Both went to work at Mercy Hospital, then took on more responsible position with the West Seneca Developmental Program on East and West Road. Patsy did not get married, but Jean married Mike Fitzpatrick, and he is a high school teacher. They have 3 girls. Billy married Sue O'Connor, and they had 1 boy, Billy, and 1 girl, Heather. Billy worked in politics mostly as business agent for the Ticket Takers and Ushers Union. He is good at his job and keeps getting reelected. He divorced Sue and married Kathy Higgins, and they own a beautiful home in West Seneca, not far from his sister Jean. Jack was Margaret and John's youngest son. At the tender age of 20, he married a great lady, Edna Mae Donovan, of Walter Street. She was from a very large family. They proceeded to have 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls, including a set of twins. I graduated from St. Thomas's in South Park, then went on to undertaking school in Syracuse. After 1 year on graduation, I worked a few months for Ray O'Connell Funeral Home. I didn't like it, so I went to work in the parts department for Frigidaire at 1018 Main Street. I worked 28 years for Frigidaire, including 12 years as a salesman in Erie, Pennsylvania. When I was transferred back to Buffalo, Peggy, Jack, and Ann stayed in Erie. Dan, Pat, and Mike went to school in West Seneca. Peggy married Jim DeFucci, and they had 3 girls. Amy lives in L.A., Donna lives in Cleveland, and Laura lives in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania. Jim works in plastics, and Peggy for years at a Dairy Queen. Now, Ann had 2 girls and 1 boy when she married John Richardson. Jennifer, who lives in Billings, Montana, Mandy, who lives in Erie, and Jay, a hell of a football player for Fairview High School. Ann works as a secretary for the Girard School Board, in charge of all the girls that worked in the school board office. Jack and Nancy Zerfoss O'Neill live outside of Erie in a town called Waterford. Jack graduated from Gannon, and Nancy graduated from Indiana University. They had 2 boys and 1 girl. 1 boy was named Brady, and the twins were Casey and Chelsea. Unfortunately, Chelsea was only 2 when she died after being in a terrible automobile accident. Her mother, Nancy, and her 2 brothers survived the crash. Danny married Debbie Galley, and they met while working after school at Twin Fair. Danny graduated from the State University on Elmwood Avenue, and they had 1 girl, Erin. Erin now attends West Virginia University in Morgantown, and 1 boy, Kevin, who is at Orchard Park High School. Danny has worked at Chevy and Delavan, and also for Saginaw and Delavan for quite a number of years. Patty married John Manns, and they have 3 children. Nicole, who is studying at Erie Community College to be a dental technician, Chris and Janelle. And Chris and Janelle, they're not planning on anything. They're just having a good time, and they go to the Hamburg schools. When I first met Patty's husband, John Manns, he worked for a pump company in Middleport, then as a foreman for the Chevy Delavan plant. He keeps very active. He is now vice president of Marano Home Builders, and Patty went on to get her license in real estate. Mike married Laurie Fouts. Her family was from West Seneca, and they had Brianna and Ryan and Corey. The children attend West Seneca grade schools. Mike worked at McDonald's, Pizza Hut, Chevy on Delavan almost 10 years, then to McCullough Coffee. Later he went to work for General Binding Company, and recently he switched to selling by joining his brother-in-law at Marano Home Builders. Laurie stayed home with the kids until now, when she went to work at a bank. The kids are into dancing and hockey. Mother Edna O'Neill stayed at home and took care of the kids while they were little. After 28 years at Frigidaire, I spent 10 years with the Chapin Own Company. The last 11 years I worked for W.C. Wood. The whole 50 years was spent wholesaling home appliances. Unfortunately, there were other relatives that influenced the O'Neill clan. The clues have grown cold, and there is no one left who can help me tell how we were related to the U.S. Senator Jim Meade. I think that his grandmother and my father's grandmother were sisters. Also, now in Jim Birmingham from around Tuscarora Street in South Buffalo. I remember Jim Birmingham had the neatest model train display running in his backyard. From Lancaster, a suburb of Buffalo, we had the Hockeys, Uncle Martin O'Neill, Mary Hassett, New York Senator Dale Volcker, Peg and Mike Lillis from Rosary Street in Lackawanna. Mike was a general foreman at Bethlehem Steel and was responsible for getting Norm Denny his job at the steel plant. Finally, a whole slew of O'Neills went to Oil City outside of Titusville, Pennsylvania to live. I hope someone will save this tape to make it easier for the next generation. You never know, someone on this tape might become